This is Heather Petrocelli interviewing the Honorable Rick Haselton on April 20th, 2015 in Salem, Oregon in the Justice Building. Rick, do I have permission to record you for the Carole Pope Oral History Project?
Absolutely.
Could you please state your full name, date, and place of birth?
Okay. Rick Thomas Haselton. I was born in Albany, Oregon on November 5th, 1953.
I've been starting each interview essentially asking, how did you first come to know Carole Pope?
Carole was my client in a civil liberties case. She was at that point an inmate at the Oregon Women's Correctional Center. I think it was OWCC, I think was the acronym. And it was litigation that I had undertaken on behalf of the American Civil Liberties Union's Lawyers Committee. I was interested in inmate litigation. This would have been 1982, 83, in that ballpark, I think. And I was interested in inmate litigation because when I'd been in law school, one of the clinical programs had been representing inmates at the Federal Correctional Institute in Danbury, Connecticut. And so I'd spent a couple of years doing that as kind of side work outside of my classwork, and I enjoyed it. So when I came home and came back to Portland, got into law practice, I wanted to be involved with the ACLU. And this may have been the first case that I undertook on their behalf. We got a communication, or the ACLU got a communication from some men inmates who were gay inmates during state prison. And what their complaint was that the prison administration was letting straight guy inmates get essentially softcore pornography, stuff like Playboy or Penthouse, things like that, through the mail, but would not let the gay inmates get the gay equivalent of that kind of publication. That initial contact morphed into an interest in terms of what the rest of the prison system was doing in terms of precluding access to essentially homosexual-themed materials throughout the system. And I'm trying to remember whether Carole contacted me or whether somehow I became aware of Carole, as well as another woman inmate at OWCC named Hazel Krummacher. And I decided I would visit them. By that time, though, I'd undertaken the case probably about 6-8 months before, and by that time, another lawyer in our firm who had come aboard a year after I had, named Janice Wilson, was also involved in the case. Essentially, the two of us decided to do the case together. And we came to OWCC, and I have this image of sitting in a visitor's room on a really sunny day, not unlike today. It was a beautiful day. And that's when I met both Carole and Hazel. What was happening was unlike with the men's prison, and I can talk about what happened with the litigation in the long run in a second, but where the men's prison was very authoritarian in terms of its restrictions on inmate mail. The women's prison administration was very, for lack of a better term, paternalistic. The administrators would talk about their girls and how they needed to keep materials, essentially look after the girls and keep improper materials away from them. And so it ranged from everything. Hazel was straight, I think. Hazel was, if I remember right, and she's got a fairly famous case in the Oregon reports involving post-conviction relief. Hazel was in for either assaulting or maybe killing her former husband in response to domestic abuse. Carole, I'm not sure I knew at that time. I'm not sure I've ever I always had the sense it was some sort of financial fraud, or some kind of theft, but we really never talked about what she was in the prison for. But what she was complaining about was that things like Ruby Fruit Jungle were being kept out of the women's institution because, again, that was inappropriate. It wasn't anything that was explicit. It was just that anything that had a gay theme to it was viewed as being a threat to good social order, actually in both prisons. At the men's prison, that was really, that approach was counterintuitive. They were letting in Soldier of Fortune, they were letting in bondage magazines, they were letting in all sorts of stuff. And so the idea that homosexual rape was somehow a threat because of people being gay as opposed to people being violent was ridiculous. But they're at least talking about things that were graphic depictions. With the women's prison, it was, again, literature that they didn't want to have come in. But it was a much broader kind of restriction of material. They're keeping mothers from getting Valentines, hand-cut, hand-pasted Valentines from their children because of fears of that the paste might have drugs mixed in with them, which was not necessarily a silly concern on their part. But what they do is they bring the mothers in, show them, the little pictures their children made or whatever, and say, look, you have two choices. Either you can pay the postage to have them sent back, or we'll destroy them in front of you. That was their approach. It was this very maternalistic kind of controlling environment, which was anything but how Carole was. So, while Hazel, again, who I think was in for a violent crime, was essentially the image of a cookie-baking grandmother. She was this nice little old lady who probably is much younger than I am now, but came across that way. Carole was smart and capable and tough and interesting. And that was my initial impression of her. As we worked our way through the litigation, which ultimately ended up in a consent decree the state of Oregon settled when essentially faced with overwhelming evidence in terms of the illegality of their male censorship policies. Carole was taking the lead at the women's prison. She obviously had a very, very good legal mind, but that's how I first got to know her.
When you were doing, did it go into litigation, the whole, get to have them be able to have access to the magazines? Did it go through the court system?
Went into federal court. But before the court ever had a rule on any matter, because we were lined up for trial on this, and Janice and I had, among other things, come up with a nationally known expert, this guy named, his last name was Donnerstein, he's from the University of Wisconsin, and he had a lot of notoriety, again we're talking the early 80s, for having done research on relationship between visual stimuli and violence and sexual violence. And so in his workshop at the University of Wisconsin, he did things like hook up guys to penile plasmographs, kind of measure their sexual arousal, showing them clips of films. And so, and so for sexual violence, what would elicit the greatest kind of reaction would be like chainsaw movies, where essentially depictions of non-forcible, lovable, or loving heterosexual sex did not elicit that kind of reaction at all. And so he ended up being, in those days, there was a guy named Phil Donahue, was a big national talk show host. And Donahue and other people, he's kind of the Oprah of his day, would show up and it would have Donnerstein come in and talk about this stuff on the air. So he's a big national expert. And so when he, and I have a friend who was on the Wisconsin faculty, and we had lined up Donnerstein to come out and testify, saying there's absolutely no relationship between essentially softcore depictions, visual depictions of essentially gay sex, much less literary depictions of consensual gay sex, and any threat of sexual violence in the institution. The state got essentially wind of that. We provided them by way of discovery in federal court, and we worked out, again, a settlement agreement in which they caved on those aspects of their censorship policies and paid these use some attorney fees. So that was the outcome.
So Carole never, she was no part, did she ever leave out of the correctional facility for any part of?
No, she was never on the outside, and for testimony or anything else. I don't think they ever took Carole's deposition even in the institution. But that's how we first met. That is how she and Janice first met, and obviously they had a life together for a number of years. And that is really how I got to know Carole as a person a little bit better, because one thing is a client to be impressed with her mind, kind of her feistiness, all of that, but it was really in her relationship with Janice, and Janice was my best friend in the law firm. And we still kid about it now. I had a bit of a crush on her, and at some point she kind of let me know that wasn't going to go anywhere for some very good reasons. And that was before she and Carole had met. But I would visit them. They had a home in southeast Portland, probably Powell on about 30th, a couple of blocks off of Powell on 30th, where, I don't know, a couple, 3 years. I remember Carole with piano, being there. Of course, she was a wonderful pianist. And just spending time with them there. I at least once house sat for them. That's how you get to know people.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the people I've spoken to so far know her exclusively through the Our New Beginnings connections, but you know her more from the personal side of it. So she never talked about why she was actually in the correctional facility much with you?
Well, not much at all, and I'm still trying to remember. I think, there's a part of me thinking that there may have been some substance abuse, but I honestly can't remember.
Yeah.
You might be able to jog my memory. But
I don't even know if I know the exact details. I think what it was that she forged her way into maybe a safety deposit box and took like $2,500 worth of silver that was in it and sold it.
Okay, so when I was thinking financial fraud, that had that quality to it initially. Okay.
And when she entered the courtroom, she was basically told she probably would get probation and God, I'm blanking on the word, but restitution. Mm-hmm. And she walked in, and the judge gave her 5 years for forgery, 5 years for theft to run consecutively. So it was 10 years, and they took her away. Her car was parked outside, and it was like, it was a very gigantic shock.
I don't remember talking to her about that at all. It would be shocking. That's an incredible sentence for that conduct.
Yeah, so that's why when I learned what you do, I was curious if you had anything to do with appeal. I can't find any evidence that she did appeal, but I don't know if that's true or not.
At this point, having been here for 21 years, I probably know just about every case, in the books over here, and I've never run across a reference to an appeal by Carole.
Yeah. So. But you did know, when you got to know her, so you knew she was a pianist, a great pianist from probably hearing it, but did you know about her background, about her education, anything like that?
Knew nothing about her family. I'm not sure we ever talked about her family. It's funny what we talked about was what she was hoping to do. We did talk a lot about Our New Beginnings. I'm trying to remember, because I'm not even sure it was initially Our New Beginnings. It was a concept of just helping women who had been, in prison acquire the skills to be able to make the transition to the outside and have successful lives, effective lives. And what I'm trying to remember is whether she ever talked about that even when she was inside. And I have I can't remember when that first started to come up.
Yeah, she did very initially towards I think she served, I probably shouldn't say because I'm not positive. I think she served poor 2 years, she got probation, and then she got taken back into custody for not, I forget the exact terminology for it, but like not taking advantage of the, or you have to correct me for what.
Well, it could even been viewed as a violation of probation if she wasn't satisfying certain conditions, but yeah.
So she went back, and then it was like, then she realized she was going to be institutionalized, and she did work with some women who were at the correctional facility with the idea. But when she got out, it was, she says in her oral history, like she was the first client. She was like, you know, to see how she could make this go. So you kind of gave me, you said that, you know, you thought she was basically bright and feisty. Do you have other memories of like your impressions of her as a human?
Utterly principled. That what you saw was what you got. Committed. You know, and I don't want to overstate this, but you hear about people who have charisma or presence. And the overstatement, because not entirely, there have been kind of 2 times in my life when I've been around people, and I just said, wow, that's like a lightning bolt. One time was with Robert Kennedy when he came to my hometown in 1968. And another time was with Cesar Chavez when he was on campus at a certain time when I was in college. And you say, okay, I get it. This is what people talk about. Carole had some of that quality. That she had a very real sense of mission and of what she hoped to and intended to accomplish, at least from that point in her life onward. I'm sure she was discouraged on occasion. Later on, there were times when she was discouraged that she would call. But at that point, you know, again, early to mid-80s, you had a sense of just this force that was going to make things happen. And, well, she very distinct personality. I mean, I don't want to portray her as being some kind of saint, because she wasn't that at all. That she was unvarnished in her views of other people and was not at all given to holding back and expressing them. And so she certainly had an ego. But it sounds weird, sounds contradictory, that there was a selfless, I mean, she was really directed towards helping other people out. And would get incredible satisfaction out of seeing essentially the people she worked with, the women she worked with, do well in the world. I've spent a good part of my professional life being around people who are pretty self-disciplined, pretty self-directed, who, a number of whom have done good things in the state anyway. I'm not sure I've ever met anyone who had that same kind of singularity and purity of purpose. And it's one of the things that I think that she and Janice actually had in common, that there was I've never known a better person than my friend Janice, and that someone of that kind of integrity. And that, I can't say it better than that, but there was a shared integrity there.
Yeah, when I hear stories of Carole's work in Our New Beginnings, it's almost hard for me to imagine her having a personal life, because she gave for that, expression, like 1,000% basically. So did you mostly see her when it was her and Janice in their home, or did you visit Our New Beginnings at all?
I must have gone to the program once or twice, but Carole would call me. I mean, we'd be talking on the phone, and But most of the time, no, it would have been with Janice, and again, it was for a couple of years. I'm trying to remember how long the relationship continued, and obviously in the end it didn't work out, and part of it, I mean, I would never want to speak, because who knows what goes on in relationships. But I do think it's hard on a relationship if you have someone who is that committed to, essentially to a cause, and it's very hard to hold together. So I probably, again, I'm thinking I probably went to the program once or twice, but mostly it was Carole calling, talking about how things were going. I'm sure that there were times when, of course, Carole being Carole with networking, she would be saying, do you know such and such? You know, if I were to call him or her, could I use your name? I know that was kind of classic Carole stuff. Carole, of course, was not adverse to putting the touch on people for money. And so sometimes she'd be calling about that. Again, those were in those early years. Later on, much later on, and you know, we really did not stay in touch much at all, but she would call out of the blue. And she'd be down. It'd be hard, and so it'd be a matter of reminiscence, or just hoping someone would listen a little bit. And maybe sometimes brainstorming about maybe another program that you'd like to put together, and that I don't think any of those ideas ever quite happened, but again, I'm talking within 5 years when she died in the last, and we talked probably once or twice in the last year before she died. It's like a lot of friendships, things slip away, and you kind of wish that you'd done a better job of staying in touch with people, and then they're gone.
Do you have memories of when you did visit Our New Beginnings, of impressions of what you saw?
If I have two visuals, and little kids' toys. I mean, that's one. And I think boxes of clothing. In terms of visions of clients, not particularly. I really don't. I do have a sense, and I don't know where it came from, of Carole concentrating on things like, among other things, interviewing skills, presenting well, and there being a real emphasis on that, but no really distinct memories.
I'm curious about your professional opinion. Carole has, the reputation of having a strong personality, but she's navigating through kind of the judicial waters of Oregon, meeting people, all different, professions. Do you remember there being people talking about her in your world of?
Well, I didn't become a judge until really after the program had its heyday. I became a judge here in 1994. But, it strikes me because with Carole, the strength of her personality could easily, and probably was, both a blessing and a curse. That there were other forceful, strong people who were attracted to her, who understood what she was trying to accomplish, and who I think were there for, really quite loyal and supportive for a long time. I've met Arlene Schnitzer twice, someone that would not know me if we walked by each other on the street. But my sense was that she was someone from pretty early on who was very supportive of the program, and I've got to believe that she saw those same aspects of Carole's character and personality that made a real impression on me. Certainly for a while, I don't know if it was true throughout, Mike Trunk, who was the DA in Multnomah County, seemed to be very supportive because he understood there was a real need for the kind of program that Carole was putting together, and he saw the results. I've got to believe there are other people who took offense. That in any world there are people who want to hold on to their turf, or who are more engaged in personality than in results. I'm sure that happened too. But
I was curious, So you're saying that basically you were appointed to the bench after, like, in '94, so after Our New Beginnings, a few years after Our New Beginnings was closed down. But you practiced law in the same law firm with Janice Wilson, and Governor Barbara Roberts was the one that appointed both of you to the bench. And I know Governor Roberts was a supporter of Our New Beginnings. You're a supporter of Our New Beginnings. Janice was a supporter of Our New Beginnings. Was that just a coincidence of, like, a nexus of support, or was there something more to that? Was there... I'm not quite sure what I'm trying to ask, but it's just one of those fascinating things where you both worked at, what was the name of the law firm actually?
Lindsay Hart, Deal and Weigler, and it was a law firm where not just Janice and I were kids there essentially, but other people who came out of that law firm. The present Chief Justice Tom Ballmer was a partner at that firm. Judge Jack Landau, now Justice Jack Landau, who is again a good friend of Janice's and mine, was there. Rex Armstrong, who was on my court, was there as of the time I joined that law firm. Bob Wollheim, who just retired from our court, was another person who had been at the law firm as a paralegal. It was a very interesting place at that point in time. So it was an interesting cluster of folks. But the funny thing is that I do have one story about the governor. I'll tell you the story. Janice was the first judge that Governor Roberts appointed. Upon becoming governor, Janice was literally the first appointment to what was then, I believe, Multnomah County District Court, and then morphed into the Circuit Court over time. And that would have been in 1990, I think. Maybe early 91. Well, so I was interested in being on our court, on the Court of Appeals, beginning in 1991, 92, and I went in for an interview in 1992 with Governor Roberts. And we did not know each other. I'd been a supporter of hers, but she didn't know who I was. She knew people who knew me. And the interview was really essentially, there were four of us who were up for two positions on the Court of Appeals. And I'd been a big fan of hers, and the interview was very disappointing. It was pro forma. It was like a civil service interview where people are working through their list of questions and go on to the next one without any meaningful interchange. And I was thinking, holy cow, what's this about? I mean, this woman who I knew was this great, warm, humane, interesting woman, and it's like dealing with a robocall, just kind of, and it was very, very disappointing. And at that point, my mother of blessed memory was still living down in Albany, and I went down to Albany after the interview and said, I don't know what that's all about. I said, I really liked her. I like her, but I have no idea, and I sure hope that's not how they choose judges. And I'm very, very disappointed. And I didn't get the appointment. Very disappointed not to get the appointment. And then another opening about a year, a little bit more than a year later, opened up. I put in one more time. I almost didn't. I came in for the interview with the governor, and she began the interview by saying, I've heard more contradictory things about you than any person I've ever interviewed for a judgeship. I said, oh, wow, well, tell me. She said, for instance, I hear from some people that you're a feminist, but then you worked on the Dalcon Shield, the defense of the Dalcon Shield. It was product liability. It was an intrauterine device. And how do you reconcile that? I said, well, Governor, that's a very interesting question, because same is exactly true of my good friend Janice Wilson, who was your first appointment. And, there are some things we work on because we are committed to them as a matter of principle. There are other things that go with the territory of being a practicing lawyer, and you represent clients. And then she said, well, or, I see here that you represent prison inmates. that wasn't on your resume the first time, was it? I said, well, actually it was. And she said, well, I really value that work. And then we had just a great chat, and after that great chat, I drove down to see my mom and said, I don't care how it turns out, that's the way it's supposed to be done, and I got the appointment. But so the long bend about is that Governor Roberts may very well have known about Janice's work and through Carole and New Beginnings, but she certainly didn't have a clue about mine until that second interview. It is certainly true that she cared and still cares very deeply about civil liberties related work and about what happens with prison inmates.
Did you know at the time, or were you involved at all when Carole, when she was still inside, suing the prison system for a law library in the women's prison?
Didn't know about that.
Is it a story you know at all?
It's not a story I know. She must have told me at the time. I mean, so to be accurate, I'm sure it must have come up, but I have no memory of that at all. So
I have a question for you. Knowing what you know about Our New Beginnings and knowing what I know what you do now in 2015, do you have a lot of statistics or know from from Janice how successful Our New Beginnings was at offering alternative to prison at times or transitioning women out of prison?
I had a sense at the time, again, I was still in private practice, that one, certainly my impression was it was the first program of its sort, and the two, that it was pretty successful. That was what I had a sense of at the time. What I think I know now, and it's not something that is statistically grounded, is what I saw. I did go to Carole's memorial and heard what people had to say. And so, in terms of metrics or qualitative stuff, I don't really know. I know quantitatively that it made a huge difference in a lot of people's lives. It's the sort of thing where, again, we're one step removed from the trial courts now, so I don't deal with issues of probation violation or post-prison supervision violation and, re-entry of prison inmates. There certainly are some kinds of crimes for which we know recidivism is huge, and a program like Our New Beginnings wouldn't make a difference. But there are all sorts of other programs, or all sorts of other offenses that we see where, yes, it's exactly what everything you read is try to put people into a position where they can go on with their lives in a good way once they come back. I mean, the best of all worlds is to deal with that before people actually are incarcerated. And I think that consciousness has become much more pronounced over the last 15, 20 years. And there are a lot, you have special circuit court programs that are directed or working in conjunction with agencies to try to give people meaningful options, alternatives. So, it's an indefinite, probably too long an answer to something, but I don't know the statistics. I've got to believe it was worth it.
Did in knowing Carole the way you did, even for the short times here and there that you did, is there anything about her that you markedly know she changed your opinion or ideas about something?
I don't know. I had worked, again, with inmates who'd been in law school. So it wasn't like I had preconceptions about all inmates being categorized one way or another. And I don't know. Carole was unique, and so from knowing her. I don't think I was drawing broader conclusions about how people were or could be, because I really did think she was exceptional. I guess if there was anything, it was that maybe there's a little bit more hope for people to be able to change their lives than I would have credited to begin with.
When Our New Beginnings was closing, did she ever reach out to you, since you were a practicing attorney at that time, for any kind of help with the legality of that?
Not with legalities. I just remember this kind of profound sense of sadness and of outrage. I mean, she was, again, she could be very angry, and she expressed that, but frustration, anger, and deep sadness. That's what I remember, and it would have been just talking over the phone. Maybe she came by the office once or twice, but I don't remember her asking me to go to bat in any particular way at that point. Later on, I served as and I wish I could remember what the proposals were. I served as a reference on a couple of later project proposals that she had, and was happy to do that.
Did any of those come into fruition?
Not that I know of.
Did she talk to you about the details of why Our New Beginnings was going to close or be closed?
I'm sure she must have at the time.
Basically she says that she had a contract with the State of Oregon Department of Corrections work release program.
Okay.
And she was, I think it was like for 12 or 14 women, and they went and breached a contract because the work was completed on a correctional facility that right now the name's escaping me, like somewhere, I think Willamette. Well, it's in Portland, but and I think that was part of the outrage, was that she had this contract that went, they basically were just like, they pulled it. That same contract existed with Volunteers of America, an organization there, and with the YWC, I think it was. But those were big umbrellas, so they could take the hit, whereas Our New Beginnings wasn't under an umbrella. It was what it was, and so the loss of that contract was detrimental.
Was the death sentence? Okay.
So I'm just curious, I know you don't have all the information in front of you, but just hearing something like that, she had said in her oral history that she couldn't go after, I don't know if it's like the Department of Corrections, but basically it was like they were immune from being sued.
Well, it would depend on the basis upon which they made their determination, and there's no immunity in terms of breach of contract. I mean, a contract's a contract, and a contract with the government is still binding. But if it was, say, instead of a breach, a non-renewal, and that she essentially had the understanding that it would be a continuing relationship and they didn't re-up, then yeah, they probably would be immune, because there's something called discretionary immunity, and if they can offer some plausible justification for that decision, that would hold. And that, it's interesting, because I hadn't thought about it until you were mentioning kind of the broader umbrella. One of, I was talking about the blessing and the curse. If you are essentially a one-woman operation, there are some wonderful things that go with that. It's very personal, it's intimate, and you get to call your own shots. The hard part is, if things go south, then you don't have a broader structure that can sustain you through those kinds of hard times.
Yeah, that's why, just going back to the personal life, it's like someone who gave so much. It's just hard to imagine her spreading herself anywhere else, based on what she gave to Our New Beginnings. My other question I have related to the work that she had done at Our New Beginnings, and I'm not quite sure what exactly it is you see in your daily work life here, but what kind of need do you see now for an organization or the mission that Carole had for women in corrections?
You know, and you know, I touched on this just a little bit earlier. It's the knee-jerk, sometimes too easy response is just to say lock people up. The community will be safer if people are, and if you spend the money on prisons and essentially housing people. And there's obviously nationally and in Oregon, there's a huge fight, and there has been, about how to strike the right balance between programs and essentially spending money for incarceration. And there's no categorical answer that way. But to step back and look at the effectiveness of programs with respect to certain kinds of offenders, to me seems to be that's the key. So yes, there's a need, and there's always going to be a need, and you're never going to, I have no idea if there is a Carole Pope out there even now. Certainly a few people who care deeply, who are involved in the various programs. Whether there's anyone who is inspiring and, again, charismatic as Carole, I don't have a clue. When you asked your question, I was thinking about this, that in Judaism, there's a saying that to save a life is to save a world. And there's also a concept that to get someone a job is the equivalent of saving a life, because you give them a sense of pride and self-sufficiency. So to do what Carole was doing is to save many worlds. And I can't imagine a life better spent.
If you were writing this history or telling this history about Carole and our new beginnings, what's the most important thing you think should be remembered about her or the organization?
I think probably what I just said.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to add? Was there anything you ever learned about Carole that in the moment shocked you, surprised you, made you laugh so hard? Like, is there anything like...
Nothing that comes to mind now. Again, she was who she was. There's a part of me that, and it's presumptuous, that wishes that maybe sometimes she could have been a little happier. But only she can know that.
Do you think, though, based on something that you had said, do you think that when you are so committed and you are so dedicated and you're trying to save a life to save the world, do you think it could be hard to find outwardly, like an outward happiness? Maybe there was a very deep internal joy, but maybe it'd be hard to have
I think so. And when you're asking, with me being, having been around the program, there have to have been times, with the children growing up, and she'd tell those stories, and again, they were recounted at her memorial, there had to be moments of transcendent happiness for her. And so it's like I said, it's probably presumptuous. I wish that in her life that there could have been that in addition to that she could have had other sources of happiness.
Do you know I know that you said that your relationship did become more sporadic after her and Janice broke up, but did you know of any significant others in her life after?
No, just never. Yeah.
Also, I'm just thinking about when you went to the memorial and you're looking around and it's like a celebration of this, woman's life. Was there anything about the people, the collection of people celebrating that life that struck you as?
And it was a collection. That every visually identifiable, part of the community was there, and that's part of her legacy.
Anything else you want to add about Carole or any other memories?
It's just been a gift to be able to talk about her, so thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.